Well, welcome to this next session, which is called Beginning of Life and End of Life Issues. One of the things that I found fascinating about this is that we're talking about beginning of life and end of life in the same discussion. And I think what unifies all of it is both beginning of life, not always but sometimes, and end of life, not always but sometimes, include making painful decisions when the data's not clear cut. You know, do you reduce multiples if you've gone through IVF? What do you do about the sick preemie? How much medical care? What about the elderly person or the not elderly person that's facing a terminal illness? How you make these decisions between quantity and quality of life. And I think for those of you here today who are journalists, it's not so much an issue to you, how do you make those decisions, but how do you present breakthroughs and how do you present medical news and make your story a bit deeper or more nuanced by getting in some of these issues that are more about ethics and economics and healthcare issues today, rather than just presenting the medical facts, which is oftentimes the easy way out. So I'm going to hand this over. I want all of you, I guess starting now, to think of questions that you want to generate to our panelists, and I'll introduce them briefly. Next to me is Robin Marantz Henig, who's a ridiculously prolific writer, and she's written on so many of these issues, both birth and death, and I use her articles often to show, when I teach to my students, to say, this is how you write a feature, this is how you keep your readers flipping through the pages, and this is how you write deeper about some of these issues. So if you go to her website, you can just easily see a list of her articles, and I recommend anyone to just take serious notes from them. Robin's also written a book on the history of IVF called Pandora's Baby, among other books and many articles, and she has an article about end-of-life issues to hand out at the end that was in Scientific American. Next to Robin, we have Michael Gusmano, who's from the Hastings Center, and Michael is, I'm sorry, let me just flip back to here. Michael's a research scholar at the Hastings Center. He has a PhD in political science as well as a master's in public policy. He's also covered a lot of ethical issues. His interests are in cancer as a chronic illness, palliative care, hospice, and a lot of the ethical issues in the end of life that are raised by dementia and the politics of healthcare reform. We also have Josephine Johnston, who works with Michael at the Hastings Center. She's also a research scholar. She's a lawyer with a master's in bioethics. She's worked also on a wide range of topics with Michael, both on beginning and end of life. She's interested in conflicts of interest in biomedical research, controversies in pediatric psychiatry, and she's currently interested in assisted reproductive technology. Among some of her interests are reducing multiple births and the relationship between reproductive choice and responsibility. So I'm just going to start off with a question for our panelists, and then we can open it up right away to all of you who want to ask. And what I'd like to start with, I'm going to start with death to go backwards. And I want to talk with, Michael mentioned to me that sometimes he feels that some of these issues are presented a little too black and white. And maybe if we can start off with Michael and see where everyone else feels on this in terms of when we write about hospice, when journalists write about palliative care, what is sort of your pet peeve about when you think it's becoming too black and white? And maybe you can explain to us while you're answering this question, what is really hospice now and palliative care, because these things are changing?
Well, I actually don't know that the writing I've seen about hospice and palliative care is necessarily black and white, but my main research is in health policy and health politics. And so one of the things, as my friend Ted Marmer wrote many years ago, that happens in the media is when issues, and most of these issues, become highly politicized, as you saw certainly during the health reform debate, a lot of papers will send their political commentators as opposed to their science writers to cover the story. And then it becomes the interesting horse race. Who's up and who's down, or the sort of convention of getting sound bites from the people on the far left in the far right, presuming that the truth sort of falls somewhere in the middle. I think one of the things that really bothered me during the health reform debate, and it bothered a lot of us at the Hastings Center, was the complete absurdity of this discussion of death panels. And the failure of many people, not everyone, but the failure of many people to just completely sort of debunk that immediately. The idea that that thing had legs was completely ridiculous. I mean, it was, I'm sure most of you know, essentially a provision that was actually originally bipartisan in nature. Several pro-life Republicans were actually in favor of this before health reform came up, which was to allow Medicare, allow physicians to bill Medicare when they had sometimes long and difficult conversations with people about end-of-life options. Because right now there's no billing code, and if you have to spend a lot of time talking to people, and you probably ought to spend a lot of time talking to people about this, you can't cover your time. And lots of people think this is a sensible thing to do. This became completely perverted in the never-ending debate to sort of demonize the Republican idea that is the Affordable Care Act, to claim that this was an effort, and this also bothers me about end-of-life coverage, I think unintentionally, that sensible end-of-life planning was all about saving money. That was the primary goal, and therefore encouraging physicians to speak with people about end-of-life was a way of encouraging them not to consume more Medicare benefits, but to be responsible citizens and go ahead and die. And that was absolutely not what was behind it. I think sort of more nuanced coverage would be helpful, but generally speaking, I think actually end-of-life coverage tends to be a little better. Health politics coverage, though, is sometimes maddeningly inaccurate, mostly because it's about kind of the political horse race, who's up and who's down, as opposed to the substance of the issues.
Well, Robin, you've written about this. Can you tell us about maybe some of the stickier points that you've had to deal with?
Well, I actually wrote, this article that I have that I'm going to hand out is more recent, and it's about changing definitions of death, especially in terms of defining brain death so that you can harvest organs. But I'll talk about that later. But this palliative care and hospice care issue is quite interesting, and I wrote about that longer ago, like 7 years ago, I guess, for the New York Times Magazine. A big article about death. That was all I was told to do, was write about death and how we face it. And what I was very struck by when I was researching that is how people don't actually understand what hospice is like now. You need a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, but it doesn't mean that you've given up all care. And I think that that's what people are very frightened of. You're actually allowed to even be on chemotherapy and be on a ventilator and all sorts of things that are not curative, but palliative, to just make you feel better. So you don't have to just sort of relinquish everything and admit that you're about to die. Unfortunately, many people think that's what it means to be in hospice care, and so the average length of hospice care is very short, only a matter of weeks. So people have come to think of it as the very, very end. What I was also struck by in writing this article was how underlying a lot of our lip service to palliative care is this sense that we really can't accept the fact that we're going to die. We individually, personally, or our loved ones, or as a policy, this odd ambivalent feeling we have about death is almost that if we can manage it well, we can somehow avoid it. I think that there's a little bit of magical thinking. Eat right. Yeah, well, if you eat right, yes. I mean, it's much the same thing as a lot of young women who think, why am I not fertile at 40? I look good. I've been taking care of myself. I look much younger. And it's that same kind of element in when you're talking about end of life, is that it means that there's an end of life. And I got the feeling that so many people, including people on hospice care who knew that they were terminally ill and would start to have trouble breathing and would call 911, rather than sort of say, okay, I guess this is it. We fight until the very end, and that's some human nature thing.
How did you find in that article, for all the journalists out here, it's a beautiful story, and Robin must have spent a lot of time with a woman who was dying and with her family. How did you get to her, and how did the family react? I mean, you seem to be immersed
Well,
And-
what I spent the most time with actually was the hospice nurse, who went from one client to another, and I spent a couple of long, long days with him. It was a male nurse, very interesting guy. And it even took me a long time to get to that nurse. You know, first I called the local hospice organizations, and you know, there were several kinds of nurses and several kinds of residential hospice versus home care hospice. And then I began, I think, thinking of a couple of different individual patients I might follow, and it just became clear that this woman, Goldie Gold, was the most vivid, you know, the most fun for me to spend time with, and I figured the most fun for the reader to spend time with. I wasn't even sure that the article would focus on her until, you know, the 10th draft. I revised it a lot. And she died between the time I handed in my draft and the article appeared. So that was a horse race, you know, just trying to figure out. I knew she was dying. I didn't know if we'd be able to say it in past tense or future tense, and you know, all that got very difficult. And I had to insert myself into this very private moment with a family that was, you know, sort of pre-grieving and also immediately grieving. So that was a hard part of it.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I've heard some of the same complaints about it's a great thing that human beings want to fight death and, you know, fight for life and have a lot of energy, you know, all those things that mean that we have trouble facing death and have a lot of good things about them. But I was recently in Texas, and I was talking to a pediatrician, and he works on a pediatric palliative care. So he's dealing with end of life in children, right? So however hard it is for us with adults, it's worse, I think, with kids. And this is a really experienced physician, and he said to me, I spend 50% of my time with this medical staff. I spend 40% of my time with the parents, and I spend 10% of my time with the children, because they know what's going on in their life, and they're pretty good about it. But he said sometimes he's the only person in the room who will say, in a medical consultation that's just with physicians, he'll say, nurses, he'll say, it sounds to me like this child is dying. And it's like no one else can even say that.
Even the experts.
And I thought, what an incredible waste of the salary and the medical degree that, in a way, right? Like that's what he's doing. Like that seems sort of like an easy job, but it's not, because of the way that we feel about it. And it's good that we don't want to let kids go and all this kind of stuff that has a lot of good in it, but it's not. It seems like it's a big problem, not just for older people, but also and it's not just the individual themselves. It's the family and the clinical team who are equally struggling with this realization that death is nearer than we would want it to be.
Do you think these struggles then have an implication on too much technology at the end, or not making the right decisions when it comes to quality of life?
I mean, I don't know a lot about the data on that, but that is what the message that I get, you know, I get from sort of not observing it very closely, and it's not any better with children and babies than it is with adults, and maybe it's even worse.
I think it's probably worse, yeah. And I think, though, it's complicated, though, right? Because, I mean, on the one hand, people don't want to admit that they're dying, and certainly we don't want to talk about it, which is a major problem. On the other hand, there are countless surveys suggesting that people don't want intensive care at the end of life. You know, virtually every survey that's been done, no matter how it's been framed or what the sample has been, suggests people prefer to die at home rather than dying in the hospital. They would prefer not to receive lots of intensive interventions at the end of life. They would prefer more palliative care. And if you look at what's actually done to people, it's the complete opposite of what they at least claim they want to happen. I do think with kids it's even more complicated. And the family dynamics are complicated, which is actually one of the reasons why they were trying to allow physicians to spend more time talking to patients and families. These are just extraordinarily complicated and difficult issues that people don't want to talk about.
So really, just kind of, I can embrace two articles I read that I thought were really fabulous on this issue. One was written by a New Yorker staff writer about his own baby's death, where he said at the very beginning, we didn't want extraordinary measures, we didn't want, and we ended up in that position anyway because we couldn't let go. And I thought it was really really powerful to see a public struggle, somebody talking publicly about their own struggle to do the thing that they, in theory, wanted but couldn't actually figure out how to do. And I think that Atilga one day has written about physicians' fear of death, and that was powerful too, to actually have a physician be brave enough to talk about it. So like the more that people can share their own and reflect on their own experience publicly, the more it helps us, at least to some extent.
There's a very interesting article in this packet written by, I think, Lisa Krieger. I didn't recognize the name, but about her own 88-year-old father with dementia who got very sick and also answered the survey, I don't want anything unnatural. I have a DNR, a do not resuscitate order. And yet he ended up in the hospital and in intensive care. And the way she structures the article is really quite moving, where she tells you what happened and how he got worse and says, should I have stopped them now? And then it keeps going and keeps going, and should I have stopped them now? I think that one of the things that's so wrong with this is that we fail to ask a question that my brother, who's a doctor, says you should always be asking, which is this the way I want to die? Is this the good death? And it would have been a better way for this father to die when he had his first infection and they just let him quietly die of it instead of pumping him with antibiotics and doing everything else that they had to do. But I don't think that we ever, I mean, it's that same resistance to the fact that death is coming. I don't think we ever make that trade-off. And there should be a moment when you can say, okay, I know I'm terminally ill, or that my mother is. Will this be an easy death?
It's hard to know the moment when you come to it. How do you recognize it?
Yes, it's very hard to know. Yes.
I want to open up.
Does being in a clinical study influence the death process if one is terminally ill? Because it seems like there might be a conflict of interest, to refer back to the previous session, on the part of the doctors who want the patient to remain alive as long as possible, because that will can impact on the data. So I just wondered whether you guys encountered that.
Yeah, I think, well, you're right, there is a potential for conflict of interest, and it is problematic, but you also have an interesting selection bias there of people who are in late stages of disease who decide to enter into clinical trials are usually the people who are sort of most resistant. My colleague Nancy Berlinger, I'm sorry, couldn't be here, tells this story that she talks about the myth of the fact that they wait to give you the good stuff till the end, like and one of the difficulties and one of the things problematic, in fact, about clinical trials is the idea that they're sold as life-saving and a great chance and these highly innovative. They are sometimes highly innovative, but the reason they're clinical trials is that they're experimental and we don't in fact know that they work. So there is, in addition to the kind of potential conflict of interest about people conducting the trial that want to establish that the drug has an effect, there's also how are people recruited into the clinical trial? What are they told about what this means for them at that stage, and whether that really makes sense? Sometimes it may, but I find it disturbing to think of the number of people who presume that the answer to overcoming this life-threatening condition is to enter the clinical trial. You may, in fact, be doing lots of wonderful things for someone else. The probability that you're going to do something wonderful for yourself is actually pretty low in those cases.
It's a little hard to express this, but I think it can be too easy when we're not in the position to make statements like somebody saying, I'm not going to want this type of measure taken or that type, and then changing your mind as if they were being consistent. I mean, I could see making a statement when the time comes saying, oh shit, please try something else.
Yep.
I'm scared, I want you to try it. Or thinking about, was there a moment when it would have been the time to let the daughter go? Well, it's a lot easier with hindsight to say, yes, that would have been the moment. But
well,
maybe
it helps that he was pretty profoundly demented, so that even if he physically recovered, that wouldn't have changed.
Right,
but she is able to
in
say
general
that.
too, not just that case.
Well,
like,
well, I would
let her
actually-
die of pneumonia, 2 months ago. But maybe when you treated her pneumonia, it could have gone a different way, and it just so happens it went a terrible way.
Right.
And that.
Well, I think she
we're
was saying.
all sitting here looking pretty healthy.
I think she was saying, is this the moment I should have done it? Because it was easy to say that in retrospect, and she was just trying to highlight the fact that how hard it is to make that decision as you go.
Right,
But it's clear when people are in hospice care and say, I want to die peacefully at home, and then have trouble and call 911, that happens all the time, is that people just, they panic at the end and they want to stay alive at all costs. I mean, at some level, a lot of people are like that.
Right. But I mean, even not at that dramatic moment, like somebody says, well, I'm going to, you know, I have terminal cancer, I'm going to want to just visit with my friends, blah, blah, blah. But it makes sense that they then say, oh, give me any new drug, let me try it.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point as well
Oh,
about
okay, we're gone.
just the timing of it as well. For example, some people can be diagnosed, they may have 6 months to a year to live. If you consider people with non-curable illnesses like motor neuron, Huntington's, multiple sclerosis, where they could have potentially 20 years and know the path that life is going to take and lose their able-bodiedness, and they know, you know, they can assume that death is going to come in a certain way. Has any research been done on that? Have you written any articles on that, or is there any kind of, do you want to comment on, you know, the time it takes to die, basically?
Well, I can say one thing. Bill Moyer had an amazing series on death, on various ways of dying, and there was one guy in it with ALS who wanted his doctor to agree that when it got to a point where he needed a ventilator, I think that's when he decided was his last moment, he wanted the doctor to help him die. And the doctor said, but that's a little early, I don't want to do that. The doctor was very uncomfortable with this. And so the guy was saying, because you're not going to help me, I have to die like a few days before I really want to, at a time when I can do something for myself, when I'm not totally incapable of doing anything and I need my doctor's help. And he was so mad at losing those few days, which I thought was amazing, because he knew exactly what the progress was. He knew he would end up wanting to cut it short, and yet he didn't want to cut it a moment shorter than he had decided was his last straw. So I think that, I mean, there have been those kind of anecdotal studies probably. I don't know.
Well, I think there's been a lot of thinking. There's been a lot more thinking. And Eric Parents and Josie wrote about the challenges that we're going to face as our capacity to detect Alzheimer's at a pre-symptomatic stage will present. And I think I wanted to respond before, and I think it relates to this point as well in terms of timing. The fact that this person was demented, I think, could potentially make it harder in a lot of ways. And to your point about changing your mind, one of the things that bioethics has spent a lot of time perseverating over, a lot of philosophers, that's what philosophers do, is the idea of the future self, which is grounded in the very commonsensical idea that most tolerably normal people change their mind, right, over time. And one of the difficulties that families face in these kinds of situations, that with a motor neuron problem where you don't lose your cognitive function, you have a different set of issues, but with dementia, it's a problem because you may say, I don't want at this point any more to be done for me. But, you know, I think Dan Callahan wrote something really beautifully. He said, what if, you know, the demented person looks perfectly content and seems in no hurry to die? What do you do then? How do you know what then they got to that point, like the cancer patient who said, I don't want any heroic interventions, and then when they have stage 4 cancer and they've gone through several rounds of chemo, tells you, yes, I want to enroll in a clinical trial. So one of the real dilemmas people face is the sort of gnawing concern that somebody might have changed their mind. And do we really know what's going on in their minds? None of us know what it's like.
Josie, as a lawyer, is some of this fear of lawsuits from the doctors? And can you?
Not just lawsuits. I mean, suits from disgruntled family members and also like criminal charges.
But what,
Because,
can
it's
you
still
get
homicide
can you
to
get
me, so it's
sued?
like-
Right, but you could never get sued, or you probably could, but you wouldn't worry about getting sued for being too heroic and keeping someone alive despite their quality of life.
Right, so
So,
that has
from a
happened
law
at
spring.
more at the medical side. that has happened. I mean, happens, right? Very much. So I think it's, I guess there are, like, I mean, I'm not a doctor and I don't do that, so I don't know what's in their minds, and I know, publicly people have said they've heard of lawsuits and have been charged with a crime if they don't do what the patient wants or don't prolong.
No, I'm saying if they do what the patient wants,
Yeah, well, so depending on what it is, right? So if they do what the patient wants and don't provide additional therapy, they can still be worried that they'll be in trouble with something else. But what I was going to say is that I also imagine that it's not just a fear of lawsuits, but it's a fear of killing. Like it's a moral issue as well. So it's a line crossing thing. And many things will have a very complex answer to that. They won't just say, well, yes or no, or black or white. But like, it's not just that they are worried about sort of the legal repercussions. I think it's also a huge moral issue.
See another. Oh.
I was wondering, sort of, to bring it back to a little bit to sort of the fact that reporters have the job of asking people what they think of something and then telling folks about it. And here there's this fundamental mismatch between what people say they think and what they actually think, both in terms of sort of personal dilemmas and in terms of policy, in terms of making policies. So, are there ways of covering that in a more writing or sort of are there ways of bringing that out in a more productive manner as we report on it?
You mean ways of making it clear that people are of two
right,
minds
that
about
maybe
this?
the answer that we're giving isn't really actually the answer or something.
Well, in the death article that I wrote, and it helps to have a lot of space. I mean, that article was like 8,000 words long, which is disappearing now. I mean, it's harder and harder to write these really long articles. But there were people I met, for example, I was sent to some patients by the palliative care department in a particular hospital, and found that when I talked to that person, well, I could never say, so I understand you're about to die, but I did say, I understand you're in the palliative care service, and she said, no, I'm not ready for that yet. So I was able to, because it's the Times Magazine, I was able to sort of put in that scene and sort of reflect on it as another indication of how people say one thing and feel another.
Well, I would say that's also a reflection of the lack of understanding of what palliative care is, and the fact that we have screwed that up so badly, mostly by tying almost all of the payment for palliative care to hospice, so that you have to, the only way to get palliative care paid for in most places is if you've been enrolled in hospice, which means that you have to forego curative care for the disease that's taking your life. And people are really reluctant to do that.
I know we have questions I want to get to. Can you just explain for some of the reporters here who might be writing on this, the difference between palliative care and hospice?
Right. I mean, palliative care, palliation is sort of much broader, and it deals with physical pain, it deals with psychosocial issues, and so you have it's now a subspecialty of medicine, although unfortunately it's mostly available only as an inpatient service, and you often have to, it's a sort of referral service, which creates all sorts of organizational and political problems within hospitals, because physicians are sometimes reluctant to refer to their patients to the palliative care specialist for fear that they will lose that patient, which doesn't usually actually play out that way, but that's kind of the way it works. Where hospice is literally a set of services, it can be at home, it can be in an institution, that include palliative care services, but are specifically geared to people who are at the end of life, who are foregoing curative care. There's no reason you can't provide palliation and help with pain and the other things that palliative care does while you're still receiving curative care much earlier in the process, and even when the goal is still to be cured. It's just that the way in the U.S. we pay for those services is mostly tied to hospice, and so people just conflate the two things, including patients who say, no, I don't want palliative care, which is nuts, actually.
Yes, pain relief, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, I'm all for open
it does seem to me that death is a bigger taboo than sex, certainly, in terms of what our views on these things. We've had a huge case in England recently about somebody who has locked-in syndrome. A guy who's, I don't know if you've read about it, a guy who's completely unable to do anything other than clicking his eyelids, and his wife is the only person apparently who can understand what he's saying. And he is desperate to be about to die. And Robin, you mentioned earlier about somebody saying, would you help me to die at this point? Now, that implies that there are doctors, and I presume they are, who are helping people to die with assisted suicide. And from the literature I read, it seems that only in Oregon, it's the only state actually that doctor-assisted suicide.
That's the only state where it's legal.
Where it's
And
legal.
Washington State.
as well.
Washington, yeah.
But I'm very intrigued because it must happen.
It does happen. I mean,
so how does the law?
in my research for this article, I spoke to, are they called Compassion and Care now? There used to be groups like the Hemlock Society, and I think they have more ambiguous names now. But there are groups that you can go to who will kind of help you end your life in a way that doesn't seem to implicate anybody else and doesn't seem to implicate them. But it's very, just today I saw an article, did you see this, about a politician in Allentown, Pennsylvania, who had a wife with dementia. He just killed her and killed himself. I mean, that's one way to do it, is to just be ready to kill yourself as well.
But isn't that incredibly hypocritical? We all accept that if somebody says, you're going to die so that you can no longer breathe, you can no longer move everything, and you want to choose to do that, doesn't it seem incredible that everybody kind of just ignores that?
Yeah.
I don't know, it's the biggest issue that I can see in this area.
Well, it's also it's problematic for lots of reasons, though, as well, and as much as I'm sympathetic to that, particularly within a society in which we don't provide adequate mental health services or adequate palliative care, there's always this sort of gnawing question that, would the person have gone down that path if they had been presented with a full range of alternatives, where I have absolutely no trouble envisioning a scenario which seemed perfectly rational to me to make that choice.
I think the rational suicide argument, and that as it's tied to medical diagnoses, is like fertile ground. It's like a really important, I think it's an incredibly important question, and as Michael said, with earlier Alzheimer's testing, it's just going to be, that's going to be an advance that's going to push that issue. And with I went to a meeting where some scientists were talking internally with us about research they've been doing on the early Alzheimer's test before it was announced. And one of them said, I'm going to talk about what I see as being the ethical issues associated with the release of this test. And I thought, oh, here it comes, right? Because to me, it's the very first thing I thought of. And he went through everything, and that was not mentioned. And there was a mention of, and then I said, well, are you not thinking that, one of the things we need to talk about is whether or not people will use this information to decide to end their lives, with or without the help of medicine. And I think there's a big difference, by the way, when you talk about what it means to involve the institution of medicine in the killing of people versus what people do for themselves. And, I don't know if institution of medicine is the right place to do it, I don't know. But he said, no, you're right. We should definitely put down here that suicidality and mental health are a real issue. And I said, no, I'm not talking about people who from this information triggers an episode of depression that leads to them killing themselves. I'm talking about people who are perfectly mentally healthy who made that decision. And they just looked at me like I was some kind of... So I think there's a real taboo about talking about it, obviously. And I thought maybe I was, when you have those moments where you're like, am I missing something? And usually you're not, but it reminds me to think, oh my goodness, there are a bunch of really smart scientists and doctors who think I'm missing something. It's a very hard conversation, and especially in light of what Michael was saying about what we don't do for people, or what I say we. I'm about to become an American citizen, so maybe I can say we.
That was your fault.
Yeah, that's right. But at the same time, I think this is maybe something that I struggle with in my work, and maybe you'll do, because I don't think there's that big a difference between journalists and bioethicists, whoever they are anyway, which is, how do you acknowledge the diversity of individuals you're writing about? So if you got 3 people together who had ALS and were going to die soon, you would get 3 different responses on exactly what they wanted in life. If you got 25 people like that, you would get 25 different responses. So to say people near the end of life want X is just crazy, right? Because there are many different things that many different people in their own individual attitudes, and they're all different. And so at least try to represent that if you're talking about some significant portion of that, that you sort of have some idea of that, or that you're just presenting one person's story. There was, the New York Times published 2 separate essays by 2 separate who both had the same condition. One said, I'm going to end my life before I get to a certain point, and I've made that claim. The other one was like all about how wonderful it is to still be alive, even though. So it's like you've got to expect that diversity, and somehow acknowledging that, I think, is really helpful, because it's, well, first of all, it's just truthful, but it actually gets at why one answer is so impossible.
I think the reason, sorry, I don't want to hold the conversation, but I think the reason that this particular case has been so important in the UK is this guy cannot end his own life because he can only blink.
Yeah, exactly.
He can't blink just after death. So,
No.
I mean, he really doesn't have much of a
Yeah,
choice.
and also the UK has its own legislative barriers that are slightly different from the
Most
law
people
in the
get shipped to Switzerland and live there, and then like
Right.
we go to
So it's,
I want to just shift the conversation, not because I have a fear of talking about death and not because I'm embarrassed of this conversation, but that we are talking beginning of life as well. And I do believe strongly that as writers that it's the same thing that we're grappling with, that it's much easier to write about a study that shows a randomized clinical trial and here's the data and here's your service piece of what you should do. And if you're writing end of life or beginning of life, there's all these nuances that you don't have the hard facts, and you might be offending some of your readers in terms of biological clocks and what you're tending. So I want to just ask a general question to all of you in terms of covering all the new stuff with assisted reproductive technology. As ethicists, is there something that you think is lacking or that bothers you in terms of the gist of how these articles are presented? And maybe we can start with Josie.
okay, well, I think some reporters do an awesome job of it, actually. And I do find some things lacking. So there are a few things there. Some are small and some are big, so forgive me. So I overall feel that, intentionally or not, there's a portrait of women who use assisted reproductive technologies as very unsympathetic characters. There are a lot of reasons for that, and they're not just about the reporting. I think there's a social bias that says that women who need to have fertility help shouldn't have children. They should get the message from biology that they shouldn't have children. And that if they are infertile, it may well be their own fault. So they waited too long to have kids, they prioritise their career, in brackets, being able to buy expensive handbags, over something important like their destiny as mothers or something. Like, I just feel like there are a lot of very, very negative, damaging stereotypes out in our culture about the kinds of women who use assisted reproductive technologies, because of course there's just one kind of woman. And it's kind of similar to me about the kind of women who use abortion technology as well. So I find some of that sense really, really, really difficult, and sometimes it leaks a little bit into reporting, or at least maybe there's a way that you reporters could try to combat that a little consciously. So one of the things a tiny thing is, like, every time people talk about IVF, they call it expensive, which kind of makes it sound like a luxury good and like something that, I don't know, sort of like a frivolous thing, like an expensive. Now, it actually is a lot of money for individuals to pay, but it's not really that expensive when you look at other medical technologies, or at least I'm not sure that anyone ever bothers to make that case, and it's just a thing that's said all the time, so I've said all the time, it must be true. And yeah, I think it carries kind of a message about this technology and the range of technologies that is not very helpful. One of the reasons it's expensive for individuals is because insurance doesn't cover it, and that debate is just not alive. It's just not alive, and it should be. One of the other things that by the way, I said to my colleagues writing in bioethics, this is not something that's just students, but let's take the example of new prenatal tests to diagnose all sorts of things much earlier in pregnancy. So a scenario might go something like, or someone might say something like, new prenatal tests are coming online that will allow women to know things about their fetus much earlier in the pregnancy before they are showing. Therefore, we expect high uptake of these tests. Therefore, we expect lots of women to have abortions for all sorts of reasons, like the sex of their baby, or just something like its intelligence or its eye color or something. And I feel like when I read that kind of story, there are so many points in that where I would like to ask questions. So I'm sure that a lot of women will have those prenatal tests, I agree. But the idea that that leads to huge numbers of abortions for reasons that people that are sort of portrayed as frivolous, to me is just perpetuates this myth about the way many women understand themselves when they are pregnant and sort of how seriously they take it. And it sort of feeds into that whole story about how women use abortion services and sort of just do it because, I can't be bothered being pregnant right now. So to me, there are ways that the stories can go that are really unhelpful and I think really misleading and damaging to women.
I think the reason it's there is that the journalist is trying to maybe contextualize it or at least make it more interesting. Journalist isn't necessarily, because I'm sure I've been guilty of doing that kind of thing. You're not necessarily, you're not necessarily sort of saying, here's this test and this is what's going to happen. You just let them open up these possibilities to provoke your reader a little bit. Same with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which I feel like is really where designer babies are likely to actually result, because then you're not even pregnant. And there's a lot you can find out about the embryos you choose to implant, including for the wrong gender.
Or choose not.
Right.
Well, some of that's a lot of, maybe someday it will become science, but right now a lot of that's science fiction, and one of the things that bothers me about the writing about that sort of stuff is that they treat the science fiction like it's going to be definitely going to become reality. I mean, in the Nova show that the Hastings Center was involved in that just aired on Wednesday, they actually brought up this issue of designer babies, and they talked about the fact that, most of the scientists say that while these are genuine ethical issues in theory, in fact, the complexity of how to actually manipulate the sort of hundreds of genes that may be involved in bringing about all sorts of traits. We know nothing about it. I've heard a funny line about, decoding the human genome is like we now have the book of life, but it's written in a language that no one on earth has ever been read. We have no clue what we're talking about in most of these things. So I think it's that's another way where you can be kind of sensationalistic and make an interesting story, but I think it's really important to kind of come back to how,
Well, even for the ethicists, though, it seems to me that it makes sense to actually ask those questions before it's a possibility, right? Before you're actually creating.
Well, it makes sense to ask them, but it also makes sense to differentiate between something that we actually have reason to believe we either can do now that we have reason to believe we may be able to do, versus things that we have reason to believe that we won't be able to do, or that. So the idea that there would be genes for intelligence and we would know what they are, and that we could use those in the selection of embryos, a lot of people think it's fantasy. And so at least if you're going to say that, you should at least say the other, if you're going to say it, and this could lead to, or this opens up the spectre of, or being like, common phrase, people selecting embryos based on whether or not they have the genetics for height or intelligence or sporting performance or stuff, it has to be followed by some comment about whether anyone thinks those things are real. Now,
But there are things that they can,
absolutely,
that they will be able to.
And so those are meaty enough, right?
Right.
Those are meaty.
right. But it's the taking it a step further for things that, quite frankly, are
To do the
highly unlikely in any of our lifetimes to be available to us. I mean, it's just not.
I think there's really, really hard questions to be asked about the use of PGD for family balancing. A really hard questions about a technology that exists right now that really is already being used. I think 5% of PGDs are done for sex selection for family balancing. So there really are real hard questions to be asked.
Right. And are they being asked, or do you think not really?
Well, it's funny, the UK just had a big public debate about this question. I think, for some really important reasons, there's a really strong, there's a pretty strong objection to interfering with people's reproductive decision making. That's, really important. It might not tell the whole story, or it might not mean that we should ask these questions. It's part of the terrain.
Just to add something on what you said, I think as a journalist, it's very important that I'm a scientist, not a journalist. I think it's very important that you start the debate, because you cannot just take what science or medicine tells you that it's right. So I think it's very important that you really raise consciousness in people, but I think it's also very important that when you're talking about science or science fiction like facts. I think it's very important because that's where, you know, the division of science or lay people and scientists grows and grows and grows. And actually what you need is to put them together, not just to separate. And so but maybe by making the story more interesting, some readers may think about it, and that's very important also to become aware. You have to criticize. You always have to be critical of what science or politics or give you. But at the same time, it's your duty to really give a clear and a real fact message. And if there are things
Well,
that
there are ways to do that, to make it clear what is possible, what could be possible, and what prickly questions are raised along the way. I mean,
but I think that's very important.
yeah. Again, a lot of that requires time and space, which is something that not that many journalists have the luxury of having, including especially the ones who are who have to put something online all the time.
Is it hopeless in that case? So for journalists who don't have much time and much space, is it just too hard, or is there?
Well,
I don't know the answer to this question.
It's hard. I mean, you need a lot of words to explain all those differences. I mean, that's part of it, and you need a lot of time to even think about it yourself, much less talk to enough experts that you can put it in context. A lot of people are, you know, just filing something very quickly, and they just have to have something to say. I mean, I don't know. I think that the best science journalists are not trying to sensationalize. It might be, you know, it was interesting what Michael said about like the wrong people being sent to cover, you know, the death panels. It's the political reporters. That happens sometimes, but to the extent that it's people who write about science and medicine who are writing about these issues, I think they're generally responsible, even when they're being sort of telescopic.
I'm hoping for some advice about, I guess, reporting ethics when you're doing these kinds of very personal stories about beginning of life or end of life. I recently wrote about a very controversial new assisted reproductive technology, and it was something where I talked to a lot of experts, and a lot of them were very paternalistic, I guess, or just very critical of this particular technology
Can you
being
say what it is?
widespread. Yeah, sorry, it's ovarian tissue freezing, which is like the next step after egg freezing. Yes. So then I interviewed this woman who did it for a social reason, like not for a medical reason. And I spent a long time interviewing her, and a lot of the conversation she was crying because she's infertile. And when I listened to the tape later, I heard myself being very sympathetic to her in a way that I wasn't even conscious of, you know, like trying to console her while she was crying, and you know, reassuring words and that kind of thing. And I tried to be as critical as possible during the interview, asking her some pointed questions about whether she knew the risks of the technology, but I guess I probably wasn't as critical as I should have been, because I had this like, emotional connection with her. And so I'm wondering how you guys deal with that, and if you have any advice.
You probably have to deal with this a lot.
I do, but I don't think that interacting with her as a human means that you like lost your job as a journalist. You know, what it will boil down to is the end product, right? If you felt as though there were questions to be raised by why she did it and the fact that it's available or whatever, you don't need to have said that to her while she was crying. But you need to sort of get past the idea that you felt sympathetic towards her to, in the article, end up with asking the tougher questions.
And then deal with that tough conversation when you send her the article when you're like.
Well, or as you're writing it, call her back and say, you know, this occurred to me. She's going to be more okay. You know, she's not going to be in the middle of crying now, and just ask her again. I mean, I've often gone back to sources when I felt it too awkward to ask the tougher questions, and especially if you're doing it on the phone, it's somehow easier to ask things that are like a little bit more personal and make it. I mean, I think you do want to let her know that you're not her mouthpiece. You know, that what you're writing is going to be something that grapples with a lot of issues, and she's not going to necessarily come off as looking like the heroine.
we actually do have this problem, even though we're not journalists, because we talk to patient advocates sometimes as part of our work, and patients as well. And we had a project that we ran on controversies in pediatric psychiatry over diagnosing and medicating children for mood and behavioural problems. And that we even were running that project was sort of offensive to some of the parent/child advocates who we invited to be part of it. And so for us it was really tricky navigating that tension between wanting to have them involved and really valuing their perspective, but not being silenced by it and not having it kind of crimp the open inquiry that we needed to have. So it's a really, like, I think it must be much worse for journalists because you kind of, some other layer there about people expecting themselves to be portrayed well in a report, you know, where they're going to be named and stuff, but it's, I mean, it's just super hard. Right? It's one of the hardest things for me to do.
Hi, I work for the Hastings Center. I'm Susan Gilbert, and I actually need to introduce Randi, but she did it herself. So, but I wanted to follow up with your how did it pan out with your story?
Coming out in 2 weeks.
And were you critical?
Yeah, it was very. I mean, and it's a UK magazine, and because of the libel laws in the UK, my editor sent her the article ahead of time to read, which is very weird to me as an American journalist. But she thought it was balanced, and she wasn't as upset about it as I thought she was going to be. So I think, and it turns out she had been on a lot of hormones the day she talked to me. So, you know, she admitted that, and she recognized that she was overly emotional. So I think for this particular one, it'll be fine, but just in the future, I'm wondering if it was, you know, I'm wondering where my responsibilities are while I'm interviewing someone like that. You know, is it okay to have a human connection?
I imagine everybody's read The Journalist and the Murderer.
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is like an eternal question.
Well, one of the issues that I wanted to ask about, and I guess maybe this is more towards the ethicist, when we speak about a lot of the beginning of life issues here in America, it's very different. There's always the fights over regulation, and it seems like a lot of the articles that are written by journalists almost have this plea that who's in charge here, and shouldn't the doctor be saying no, or shouldn't somebody be monitoring what these like wacko doctors are doing because a desperate couple asks them to do, and shouldn't we be regulating this whole business? So I just thought maybe you might want to comment.
Well, just for me, so when I first started doing bioethics, I was like a lawyer doing bioethics. So I was like, where can we put some regulation in place? So everything I didn't like, I was like, we need to know about this. And now I'm just like, that's so seldom the right thing to do. Occasionally it is, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do just because you find something troubling or think it's not good. So there are lots of things that can be done, which is not to say I think that the fertility industry in the US is just fine. It's not obvious to me that national regulation or, you know, is like the answer or like even possible, et cetera, et cetera. So there are other things. One of the things that would be most helpful, I think, very helpful, and that we're trying to encourage, that we're trying to play our part in doing by having this project we're doing about how to reduce the multiple birth rate following fertility treatment, is to actually see if you can get fertility physicians to speak out against each other in a way. So a lot of fertility physicians have a lot of critical things to say about the way that their practice is done, and some OBGYNs and pediatric neonatal intensive care people, etc., have critical things to say about the way REs manage their practices, and they have critical things to say about the role of financial incentives in there, because so much of assisted reproduction is paid for out of pocket, that and patients look at success rates in a particular way, and so you can get inside medicine and get people inside medicine to speak about what they, you know, their concerns about it, and then it doesn't look like fertility medicine is just one sort of cabal of cowboys who are all just out to do whatever crazy thing they can do. So something a bit more complex, and there are leaders inside of fertility medicine, some of whom are really trying to change the way some aspects of a practice, which is not to say that everything's fine, but I'm just helpful, if not more, than passing a piece of legislation that would regulate the industry more.
Also, you know, I agree with what Josie said, although one thing I will say, and I'm not sure this is a plea for regulation certainly, but certainly for greater attention. One of the things that struck me in doing this project was I knew relatively little about this area when we began, was if you read most of the scientific journals, if you read the literature in bioethics, and if you read journalistic accounts about fertility treatment, it's, you know, not quite all IVF all the time, but pretty close to that, where a lot of the problem with multiple births and the complications associated with multiple births are due to the use of ovarian stimulation drugs. And in fact, we even have policies that, as Josie's written about it, encourage people to, or require people to actually go down that path before they can receive IVF, or before anyone will pay for IVF. Yet nobody's writing about that, and the there are regulations that sort of at least a little bit in terms of IVF, and there's sort of attention being paid to IVF and calls for single embryo transfer. Yet very little discussion about the appropriate use and the problematic use of these drugs, which can be prescribed by OBGYNs.
So and nobody has to sign on for, I promise I'll do a selective reduction or anything like that. Nobody's able to do or require that.
No, absolutely not. And I'm not sure that I think that
Yeah,
would be the right way to handle it. But it's like a drunk in the lamppost, isn't it? I love that one. I only learned that here for like 3 years ago. I was like, that is awesome. So it's like, because IVF is controllable, like you can control how many embryos you transfer, therefore, and it's like we know a lot about it. We know how many, like there's a reporting requirements. We know how many cycles are done, etc., transfers, and how many are transferred, and all these things. That's where we've been shining all our light, and yet ovarian stimulation treatment is a far greater contributor to the multiple birth rate in this country than IVF. And yes, we talk about it. And when you ask doctors about it, they're like, oh, this is so hard, because it's not just fertility specialists, it's OBGYNs, the technologies, like the ultrasound technologies in an OBGYN's office to monitor egg development is completely different, or not as good usually as the kind of technology that a reproductive specialist has to monitor egg development. There is debate about, and changing all the time, about how to modulate the protocol depending on how the woman's body responds, etc. It's very complex, like too complicated in a way, and so we just don't bother about it. But Michael and I don't bother about it.
And the cost issue is a big deal too.
Oh, yeah.
Because the cost per treatment with IVF is so much greater that yet there's all this attention for the reasons Josie mentioned.
Right, but we might require a woman to go through 6 cycles of ovarian stimulation treatment, which costs thousands of dollars as well, and spend a couple of years of her life and potentially get pregnant with multiples, before we would allow her to go to IVF treatment, which is on a one-off basis more expensive, cumulatively more successful than it is on, like, people talk about success rate of 75%. I'm not telling you this because you know it, but like cumulative success rate for a good candidate is like 60% or higher. So we make her wait to do that. Meanwhile, time passes, money is spent, things are risked that could be very, very, very difficult. And so how much sense does that make? And does that really make economic sense? And when you look at the cost of multiple births, especially high order multiple, or even twins actually, but triplets, then it just starts to feel like very crazy then.
Can we talk about selective reduction a bit? Because to me that really ties birth and death together, because you're getting someone who's dying to be pregnant, and yet they might have to make a decision about, which we euphemistically call selectively reducing one of those embryos, and that is definitely based on not full information. From a little bit about what I've known from reporting on this a bit is that it's got to be really difficult. People that have done it don't talk about it. There's a lot more selective reduction. Doctors will tell you than we know, because no one wants to admit that they started off with quadruplets, or they started off with triplets, or they started off with twins and didn't think they could handle twins and selectively reduced one. And it's a very difficult decision, and I think it's probably more taboo than death, although it is death in some ways. But we'd rather talk about end-of-life issues than selective reduction. So what is your, how have you seen this covered, and how would you like to see this reported on?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit biased because I talked to Ruth Padover a lot during her article that I think
in it.
actually. And when I say a lot, I think I spoke to her for like 3-4 hours total. So like 3 times. So talk about time and space. She had thousands of words, and she had weeks and weeks to do it, if not months. And she was willing to talk to me for like 3 or 4 times, like an hour each time. And I was happy to talk to her. And when I started, I learned at least as much as she did from the conversations, because when she first started talking to me about it, I didn't actually know that. I hadn't thought about it. So I think she did a really good job in that article. It was a really hard piece to write. I don't think I'm reaching any confidences to say that she found it really hard to write and was freaked out about whether she was getting it right or what even that would mean or how she would not. She was like appropriately really conscious of the difficulty of what she was doing, and I thought that was, at first I was like, okay, it's the first time I've ever had a journalist be like, oh my, I just don't know what I think about this, and like maybe that's partly her personality, but she was so vocal about it.
She's a good friend of mine. It's totally her personality.
Right, but it helped her write a really good
Yeah,
story, right? That she was that sort of self-doubting the whole time, and like when the New York Times fact checker went through it and stuff, or when the editors went through it, she was like, nobody, how do you change anything? I'm so freaked out. Like she was even freaked out that they thought it was good. I think that she did a pretty wonderful job. And it's one of those cases that reminded me of what you were saying, that women she spoke with were very, as you see in the article, brave, or she had these stories that they trusted her with, and it's extremely controversial what they did, admitted to doing, and had their names, sometimes their full names associated with it, and she, I'm sure, would have good things to say about how she felt about her obligation to them, and yet her need to tell their story, and it's really tricky, I think. I don't know what else to say, because I think it's super hard and complicated, and
I haven't written about that. I've written a history of in vitro fertilization, which in the early days did involve a lot of multiples, because they were putting back 7 or 8 embryos because they wanted to save money, and they thought that the success rate was so low that they thought, okay, well maybe we'll get 2 out of it. But it turns out, like even in the early days, Howard Jones, the doctor who created the first American test tube baby, always said that twins is a failure. And I don't think that that's ever what the families thought. Families thought, this is great, this is an instant family, we can only do it once. And the doctors, or the responsible doctors, were concerned even about twins. I think part of the problem, part of the difficulty of writing about this is that it also gets very wrapped up in abortion politics. And it's really hard to talk about the ethics of something like fertility treatment without talking about the ethics of abortion. I did write an article many years ago about premature neonatal intensive care units, and at that time, this sort of borderline where they could save newborns, preemies, was like 24 weeks, and now I think it's probably even lower.
It's not really gone down that much.
Okay, but it butts up right against a legal abortion. Not illegal, an abortion that's legal. So I was very uncomfortable writing about these, fetus-like babies, and knowing that I was sort of opening up a whole can of worms for people who had different ideas about abortion than I did.
And it's hard, I think it's something I personally struggle with, is how to write critically about some of these things without disrespecting infants who've survived and done really well, or infants who've survived and had problems, or there are so many women who are so happy that they have twins. How do you write about, how do you advocate for single embryo transfer without, and I think it's possible, but that's part of the dilemma, is like how do you write about that and talk about all the difficulties with twins and all the risks that people are not willing to talk about? How do you do that without somehow also saying all you women who've got twins because of IVF, you took unreasonable risks with the lives of your children? Like, how do you not, disrespect and insult people who, and somehow claim that the lives of these existing children shouldn't have come into being, or they shouldn't have come into being the way they did, or something, without, I think it's possible, but I think that's part of the
when you're talking about premature care as well, because there are some parents who want the doctors to do everything, and then you alluded to lawsuits. There are some parents who sue doctors for doing everything.
Yeah, at the beginning of the lawsuit,
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say the one thing that hadn't come up, because I think you're right, it's very difficult to write about this. I actually think, given the challenges of writing about this, the stuff I've seen on selective reduction has actually been pretty good, because it's a highly problematic area, although, you know, Josie alludes to, you know, all of the complaints from the disability rights community come in too when you're talking about these things, even when talking about the issue we're writing about. I mean, it's not difficult to recognize it's highly problematic if you could avoid it to have children with severe health problems. And sometimes you're talking about children who are going to be able to live and survive, but with severe disability. And I think, again, this invokes the whole question of, are we being disrespectful to the sort of the value and quality of lives of people who are going to live with disabilities? And so it becomes, even before you get to the abortion question, which is going to blow the whole thing up, you have all of those issues too.
And we have this is just I think slightly ludicrous kind of cultural idea about multiple births, like how cool and like how wonderful, and all these TV shows, and like they sort of show the chaos, but I don't know if the message really gets through. And yeah, not very many people are willing to say. I mean, there are studies showing the impact on psychological and financial impact on the well-being of parents with multiples, including twins, and that it takes a toll. So there's data out there, but there aren't as many real stories, or somehow, you know, that kind of message is sort of not. It's just I think there's this idea of like how wonderful triplets, what a blessing, you know, 3 times as good or something.
Well, we were getting a signal from outside. I guess it's like the music of the Academy Awards. Right, so I don't want to open this up
I want to make a
quickly.
really quick comment. I find it interesting that panel on the Circle of Life was overwhelmingly female.
Yeah, I noticed that.
I mean, there was one guy here.
Okay,
I don't know. I'm talking about the audience.
Right.
It gives such potential for a feminist type, doesn't it? It gives such potential for that.
Are there any other last questions or comments before we wrap up? And I want to hand it over to the panel. I want to thank you all for coming. Is there any last comments that you want to make in terms of generally covering this?
Well, I actually brought this article.
Okay.
We didn't get a chance to talk about this issue at all, but you might find it interesting to read, because when you're defining the end of life, the moment of death, it has all sorts of implications for when you can start harvesting the organ. And I mean, there's an ethicist who I quote in here who said, well, maybe what we should do is just get rid of the dead donor rule and admit that sometimes we're taking organs from people who are about to die, but they die from the organ harvest, not from the withdrawal of life support.
And I would just like to end up by saying for all the journalists in the audience, that it's always, I think it's a good thing to remember when you're writing about any medical topic, to think maybe I could put a call in to a bioethicist. And just, even if you think that the issue seems so black and white, often the ethicists have thought about this longer than you, and even just calling the Hastings or calling a bioethicist to say, I'm writing about this and it seems pretty straightforward to me. And sometimes they can add something that hopefully won't take that many words, and even if you're doing a blog, you can slip in something to inform your readers of the complexity
And
of the
if
issue.
you call us, not that not that I'm looking for a whole lot of calls, but I actually do not care if I'm quoted. I'm not being stupid here. I really don't. I just want to help people write better stories, and I learn so much from talking to students. So, like, other people maybe, I don't want to speak for all bioethicists because we are a very diverse group, but it's a part of our mission as an institution to help public debate, and so we, like, yeah, I mean, I personally just do not care.
Yeah, and I was before joining the Hastings Center several years ago, I worked at a group called the International Longevity Center, which was started by Bob Butler, who was the first director of the NIA, the National Institute on Aging. And we actually ran something very similar to this every year. We funded by the New York Times Foundation, and they funded those things.
That's very good.
Called the Age Boom Academy. And you know, our policy was we really wanted to encourage journalists to call us about these issues, and we really didn't care, as Josie said, whether or not we were quoted. We were happy. I mean, we think part of our public mission is actually to provide information to people who are trying to write intelligently about these things. So.
We'll be dealing more with that in the editors and writers panel, which I'll be moderating at the end of the day, and I hope all of us will come to it. In the meantime, I just wanted to thank Randi and Robin and